Great Wednesday, I should say. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. So how you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing well, Kings. I'm staying warm here in Connecticut. It's not quite winter yet, but the weather doesn't recognize that, so it's cold and we have some snow on the ground. But I can't complain. I'm doing okay. How
Are
about
you,
you?
you all have snow?
Yeah, we got 6 inches on Sunday
Wow.
evening, and where I rent a house, and it's a long driveway, so I have to have it plowed. And the guy that usually plows bailed last week. He told me he wasn't doing it this year, so I had to clear it with a shovel, like 2/10 of a mile.
Wow.
So my body doesn't really want to do that anymore.
Yeah, you're supposed to get a neighborhood kid to do that. That's where they're supposed to come in.
Yeah,
You
that's
know.
days. I mean, there's just not a lot of those kids were willing to work that hard like I was when I was a kid. But anyway, I'm whining here, so I'm good. I'm good.
All right.
How
Excellent.
about
Excellent.
you?
Well, yeah. Recovering from some things. I'll lead that into my gratitude moment. Doing great. Hasn't snowed here yet, but you know, in my gratitude moment, as I say, I'm always grateful for life, health, the ability to sit here, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. But also grateful for the lessons that life shows us, and grateful to the consciousness to be aware of the lessons as well. So for me, it's I'm in a strange situation, the economy, because I'm looking at it's sad to see your parents grow old, and slowly, see my mom lose her independence
Yeah.
and then wrestle with that fact that she's losing her independence. But then I'm still thankful that she's still alive and has a sound mind.
Yep.
So that's the part that's hard, as you want to do more for your parents. You definitely don't want to see your mother suffer, but the same token, selfishly, you still want her to be alive and be there.
Yeah.
So wrestling with that, but still, grateful for every moment that she's alive and every time I get a chance to speak with her and get a chance to prepare myself for inevitably what's going to come, but still have her here to treasure on a daily basis. So that's what I'm grateful for. That's my gratitude.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for that. And I'm grateful again for my standard gratitude is for indoor. It sounds like a joke, but I really mean it. So, indoor plumbing, a refrigerator with most food in it that I can rely on and I can replenish pretty easily. And I mentioned the snow, and I'm grateful that when I had to go out and move, it was only about so about 3.5 inches and then about 2.5 inches, but my body can still do that over 2.5 hours and not fall apart. So I'm grateful for that as well. And then I just want to just reflect on what you said about your mom. The real irony of watching our parents grow old that's actually a blessing, because in natural stages we're designed. It's good news when we get to watch our parents grow old and we bury them,
Right.
because the opposite, when parents bury their children, is horrible. And I say that with not as a downer, but since we're going to be talking narratives, today is the 10-year anniversary of the shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, which is about 20 minutes from where I'm sitting. And we know across the country, just in terms of shootings, the number of families that have buried their children, much less from other causes. So I really appreciate your gratitude that your mom is still alive with a sound mind, even though it's tough for us to watch our parents gradually lose their independence. It's better than the other way around. So
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said, in every situation, I really, I can't judge other people, but I know I can look at my life and say that no matter what circumstance that happens, there's always a blessing in it if you're willing to look for it.
yeah.
I remember, I believe it was either, I forgot at this point, it was Zig Ziglar or Norman Peale Vincent, one of those two motivational speakers. But I read those books when I was in my early youth. I remember one of them saying that in every problem, if you unwrap it, there's always a present You just have to be willing to unwrap that problem.
Yeah.
And I have learned that, on the opposite side of the challenge or the issue is always the triumph. But very few people get to the triumph side because they so focused on the problem.
Yeah.
Or the victim of why the problem's happening and all that, as opposed to just being solution oriented and saying, well, the problem exists. Here's a chance for me to learn from it, and what am I learning from it? And then, as a result of that process, you become a better, more wiser person as a result on the other end of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Because if you're human, you're going to bump into a series of problems throughout your life. They change form, they come from different directions, they have different characteristics, but going to be things that we wish weren't true come our way. And as you said, how we navigate those is a big deal, because that's the choice point we have. We don't have a choice in terms of what comes at us externally.
Right.
But we always have a choice, even if it's not a great choice, but we always have a choice in terms of how we navigate it. So yeah, I agree with what you said.
Yeah. So, and continuing our discussion, so why don't you set the context for our discussion today?
Yeah. And I'm going to just, jump in case some folks haven't heard previous episodes. So we're grounding our discussions on this book, Healing America's Narratives, the Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And there's a tagline at the bottom there. It says, becoming more fully human. And that's where we get this idea of fully human connections from. And this book came out in October. And, what we've been doing is looking at various issues and episodes in American history that point to some of the narratives that have to be healed, and specifically the evidence of the national shadow, the part of America that we would rather not see and sometimes don't see. And what we've spoken about in the past was this idea that the shadow of America, that part that we tend to deny, and not that every single American denies it, but enough deny it to make a problem, or a series of problems, tends to be dominated by an unhealthy iteration of masculine energy or masculine spirit. And masculine energy or masculine spirit means things like individualism, wisdom, justice, agency, stepping in, getting it done. Whereas feminine energy or spirit is more about relationship, mercy, compassion, embracing. And both of those can be healthy or unhealthy. Either of them can be healthy or unhealthy. So we're not saying the masculine is bad and the feminine is good. We're not saying men are bad and women are good. We're saying that the history of the United States has been dominated by, in many cases, unhealthy manifestations of the masculine. And more specifically today, and actually, you and I have spoken already. We've spoken about the history of women, the history of Native Americans, the history of African Americans, and again, we say the history of bits of each, because obviously there are thousands of volumes on each of those. The history of Vietnam and the history of post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And today we're going to focus our attention on an issue that, if we don't address as a society and as a planet, makes all the other ones moot. In other words, if we don't address this one, it's not going to matter because we're all going to be gone. And that's what I refer to as ambivalence about the planet. More specifically, climate change, global warming, species extinction, resource depletion, overdevelopment, and those type of things, which we see as population goes up. More and more of that was taken for granted by our ancestors because they had no way of knowing what was going to come in subsequent centuries. We can no longer take for granted, and things are changing. So that's the kind of a long introduction, but I think a pretty accurate introduction about speaking about this idea of, we'll just use the phrase of climate change as a kind of a catch-all, but it really includes global warming, again, species depletion, species extinction, and resource depletion as well, all um, are happening to this vehicle on which we live, the home that we all share, whether we like it or not. And though there are some billionaires who want to shoot rockets into space and think they might live on the moon when things get bad, I tend to lean in and think if you can't save everybody, then let's stay in this and solve the issue together down here, rather than sending 12 people up into space for a couple of hours. That's another issue. So.
Yeah, just real quick, that reminds me of a movie that Arnold Schwarzenegger played in. I had the name when I was about to say it, and it Total Recall.
Yeah.
And that's the part about living in space that's scary to me, is that what that movie showed me was that you have to understand that oxygen that we take for granted here on Earth is free. No corporation controls it. Yeah. In the movie, corporations controlled oxygen. And so folks who actually had the power or the ones who had oxygen, they can turn on and turn off whatever they felt like it. And people had to pay tax in order to have it on. Yeah. And so that to me is like, as you talk about billionaires going out in space, that's what that's going to lead to. Somebody's eventually going to control who gets the food, who gets oxygen, because it's not an abundant resource like it is here on Earth, right? Yeah. And so that would be one of the first reasons why I would not want to go out in space. It's to trust that someone's going to be as plentiful and as giving with the natural resources that we need to survive, because capitalism shows you that folks not. They get a chance to control it. I remember when I was a kid, I made a joke one day. I don't know why I did it, but I said, one day we're going to be paying for water. And this is where we used to just get water from the tap. We get water from the fire hose. We get water from everywhere. There was no, real reason not to get water. Water was water in our mindset in that time. But now it's like, we don't even drink faucet water for the most part. And, and you constantly buying water is more of an accepted thing now. Yeah. So imagine children who've grown up now, who've never had the opportunity to know what it feels like to not have to buy water. That water has now become a commodity. So that's I would say, more realistic, more pressing, urgent issues about climate change that we need to be more mindful of. But the issue I see with climate change, as far as people being much more attentive to it and definitely more conscious about it with their actions, is that I use an analogy like working out. It's something to be concerned about, but it's not urgent in most people's minds. And because it doesn't give an immediate impact to them, that's something that can be dealt with down the road. And I'm not saying they're right for that. I'm just saying that that's what I see as one of the reasons why people don't take, majority of the people, because I believe if you were to take a poll, the majority of people will be more concerned about being more climate conscious and things than their behaviors show, if you give them options. I think the behaviors don't match that concern, just because of the fact is people are in survival mode, and the fact that that's not an immediate consequence in the context of, if I don't recycle this plastic bottle, if I don't recycle my, past paperwork, I just throw it out. If I, drive this car that's not energy efficient, those type of things, or I support these corporations that don't really care about climate issues with my money, because the fact is it's more convenient for me, then I'm not going to suffer anytime quick, soon, as a result of those actions.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, I appreciate that. It's really complex. I have to go back just for a second to how you began with the idea of paying for oxygen. And you and I are both old enough to remember going to a gas station and putting air in our tires, and there was no place to drop money. Just use the and you're paying for a service that was like being pumped in. But then, I don't know, a decade or two ago, they started putting $1.50 in quarters.
Right.
In order to put 3 minutes worth, you have to rush around and get, because it goes off in 3 minutes. Although a lot of gas stations are backing off that say, for free air, come inside and we'll just turn it on for you. But it's a goofy example, but it was just that, to pay to put air in my tires, So I just carried a bicycle pump in the trunk of my car with a tire gauge. I said, I'm not paying anybody for air. So, but to your point, the idea of convenience, yeah. Especially if somebody has worked hard in his or her life and has, done reasonably well. And suddenly, because of climate change, they're being told to change behaviors or do things differently. And they think they earned their pleasant life and they don't want it taken away. But most of the things that we earn, or that we kind of take for granted in this country, there are people, and again, we're talking about America in these conversations, but people around the planet, the idea of safe drinking water that's a luxury in many places. We just were fortunate enough, as you said, you used to go and turn on the tap and drink water right out of the tap, and that was fine, which I still do. I just take it out of the tap and I filter it. And I've lived in a place that had well water a few times, but we're ahead of the game here, because for the most part, drinking water in the United States is safe. Not everywhere. I mean, Michael Moore will tell us about Flint, Michigan, and other places like that where it wasn't safe for many people.
In Mississippi as well, yeah.
Yeah. Mississippi is a great example. Yeah. So, and that's really a point. There's a whole politics behind that failure of infrastructure and a failure of caring, because that didn't happen in wealthy areas. So it gets into politics as well. But what to zero in on what tying this in with the theme of the book. I think what's happening, where some people subconsciously are increasingly aware of climate change, even if they don't want to believe it, is because you can argue what the causes are, but the West in the United States burns. I mean, California is the worst, but Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, I mean, even the state of Washington, big chunks of the West burn every year, and the fires get worse and worse. The nature of hurricanes, primarily in the east and southeast, that come up now. There have been several in the last decade that have been larger and more destructive, and going back as far as what happened to New Orleans, and that was more than a decade ago. The storms are getting more destructive. The contrast of both severe flooding in parts of the country and severe drought in parts of the country. And then just the major shifts in average temperature. And that's what global warming is based on, because some clowns, even in the United States Congress, come in the middle of the winter, with a snowball. This happened several years ago.
Right.
Global warming, I just made this snowball, huh? And, that was kind of grandstanding, but we're not talking about anybody's particular neighborhood. We're talking about the planet as a whole. And in fact, in the United States, the hottest, warmest 10 years have been the last 10 years. So in other words, if you want to look at the warmest years on record, since they've been keeping records, 9 of them have been the last decade. So the evidence, for those who believe in evidence and real science, is growing. And the longer, some said, all we can do now is limit, because we've waited too long to really take action. In other words, bad things are going to continue to happen, but if we can really act now, we might be able to limit some of them, but we can't prevent them anymore. Too much damage has been done. There's debate around that, but I've found that most of the research that argues against that is funded by large global corporations who are, in fact, polluters and want to prolong changing how they operate for as long as possible. Because you always have to read who funded the research before you take the results of the research at face value. I mean, a good example of that, which wasn't climate change, a good friend of mine who's somewhat hypochondriac, who's kind of always worried about germs and getting sick, years ago, um, gave me this research that showed studies that proved that using a dish towel in your kitchen, to dry your hands or to dry dishes, was not good for your health because they carry germs. And the best thing to use was paper towels. Now, again, paper towels are things that, because they get wet, you don't recycle them, you throw them in the garbage. It's a really good argument for not using dish towels, which have to then be washed, but using paper towels. And I read through it and I went to the footnotes and I found the sourcing. And Kimberly-Clark, which is a large paper manufacturing company in the United States, they had funded the research. So, of course, they found that using more paper products was better than washable dishcloths. So that's the type of thing we have to really be aware of. I mean, again, it's not completely unrelated to climate change, because it's about resource depletion and waste and landfill because of creating more trash and things that are not recyclable. But the research stuff is really nuanced, and we have to be really clear on finding out who funds it, if it's real science or somebody who has kind of a motivated reasoning behind their conclusions. So that was a little bit of a rant. I'm sorry.
No, I think that brings up an excellent point. I think nowadays, politics plays such a major part of everything that we do, and politics is definitely driven by greed and continued capital consumption.
Yeah.
And again, that's why I'm an advocate behind, what you see behind me, the spiritual capitalism component of it, because, as you know, conscious capitalism, which that movement, that ideology, I was definitely advocate for many years, that brought us out and made us conscious of the impact that companies have, or that our company, if you're creating a company, would have on the ecosystem, the environment. But the difference I see between being a spiritual capitalist and a conscious capitalist, and this is my accession, I'm sure someone else from conscious capitalism can give other reasons why conscious capitalism incorporates this, but what I'm leading to is the fact that conscious capitalism kind of looks at it from a context of, I understand there's environmental issues and I should be more mindful of those environmental issues. And I need to think about that in my practices and my production and how my company operates. Where if you're a spiritual capitalist, you're more like, when I create my company, I'm going to be more mindful of that from the very beginning. Because my company now is designed as a business. The first commandment is business is a spiritual experience. So I'm creating my company to create value for the world, for the planet, not to make money. And then you're changing your thinking about it because of how it impacts. I think that's kind of the difference in, all these socially conscious movements of triple bottom line, any of those always are, I look at it as after the fact adjustments.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that, I'm a person that I look at it from my own personal self, that anytime that you can look at and you say, well, King, you should change your behaviors, because even though you might be enjoying this, but it impacts the ecosystem you live in a different way. And if you can show me the data that backs that up, or people being impacted by that, I'm going to be open to that. I'm not going to just push back on that to advocate for my right to do it. And I guess that's where I'm going with the spiritual capitalism perspective, is that when you begin to see yourself as a spiritual being in this planet, and you're here to do value and you want to create love in all that you do, and I'm not saying this to be hokey pokey, but I'm saying this as a way of life, that we have to begin to start thinking this way, because the folks who don't think this way are the ones that continue to use their capital to influence and control, and as you say, pay for studies or pay for lobbyists to advocate for their company's benefits, so that their shareholders continue to grow, and everything's about making more and more money despite of how it looks. I still go back to what I learned from Native Americans with this logic of the 7 generational mindset.
Yeah.
When you want to, any of your actions, you want to always put it in the context of how it would impact 7 generations down the road.
Yeah.
And if you thought about that in everything you do, I know that's almost impossible, but that's becomes the goal. Then you would do different actions.
Yeah.
You would behave differently, right? And so I'm with you 100% on the fact that we have to be mindful of how we can be more environmentally conscious in the choices that we make when it comes to our daily lives. And then I believe that that's the first step. Then you can begin to look at how you as a company or a leader, CEO, can now look at what your company can do to be more mindful and aware and create recycling practices in your company. But then take it to another level and begin the education of it. How many people right now, if they had to choose different straws that you were given, here's a free straw that's a typical plastic straw, and here's the newest straw that may be 5 cent more. How many people will actually pay that 5 cent extra for that straw that you're going to throw away after you finish your drink? But it's an environmental act behavior that, like the 5 cent bag that we have. I'm curious to know how many people would say, uh, even though I would, if they drop 5 cent, they more like not even going to pick it up, but they will hold on to that 5 cent just on that principle.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, I love, how you couch that in terms of the difference between, conscious capitalism, and just people listening to this. He didn't say conscious capitalism was bad, but he's talking about evolving it beyond what conscious, does, and into spiritual capitalism. And when you reference the Native Americans, I really appreciate that as well, because, going back to this masculine feminine piece, when the Europeans came here, they came here with basically a Christian ethic. Not that all the founders, were Christian. Some of them, really weren't practicing Christians, although they were raised with that in Great Britain. But they didn't have the same reverence for the land that really kind of indigenous peoples everywhere have, because they live on the land and they draw from it and they respect it, even when they have to kill something for their own nourishment. When they kill something to eat it, it's a sacred act,
Right.
and they bless it. If you look at a slaughterhouse, in a state that has slaughterhouses where they just corral the cattle, they funnel them into a place and just slaughter them with no sense of killing a living being. That's a whole different approach, and it comes from, and this is where the feminine really comes in. This idea of approaching life with more of a sense of embrace, of being in relationship with, of mercy and compassion, as opposed to moving into something, being an individual and dominating it, which is what we've done with the planet. Even though the planet is a living thing, historically, Americans, and not every single American, but the culture at large, treats it as an object, something other than us. And in fact, physically speaking, we're another species of animals on the planet. Now we have this whole other free will thing going on, and a prefrontal cortex, which is a mixed blessing. It allows us to do some really cool things, and also allows us to do some things that are really cool, but not in the best interests of everyone. But we clear cut forests, which basically are the nature's gift for saying, okay, I'll take your carbon dioxide and give you oxygen again, because that's what the trees do for us. And we've really objectified the planet as though we're not part of it.
Right.
And so, from a more feminine embrace, which which Native American peoples brought to their relationship with the earth, and still do bring to it, that's the movement that we really need to take now. Because as long as we still think of this as a big rock that we get to take from, as opposed to this living entity that we're part of, we're going to continue to suffer and deplete resources and cause more problems. We need to be in relationship with the planet. Um, and that's a real shift, developmental move for human beings, especially because of the greed and excess that many human beings practice. They have and they want more than they will ever need, and they take that both from the planet and from other human beings. And they justify by saying, "Well, I earned it. I worked really hard and I earned it," which and that's not false. They did work hard and earned it. Um, but then, what do you do with it? What do you do with all of that excess that's not doing you or anybody really any good?
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
To your point, and I want to go back to human behavior, because at the end of the day, that's why I think that everything that you laid out in your book is really couched in human behavior. And again, the systems that control the human behavior that we exist, or or our way that we operate within the world. And what I mean with that, real quick, I'm going to take a side step and come back. I was a part of a 3-week series of what's called Changing the Conversation. And it was sponsored by a Jewish organization called the Associate here in Baltimore City. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the relationship between Blacks and Jews. Okay. And they had 2 professors that had written a book, a Black professor and a Jewish professor had written a book on Blacks and Jews in America. And so the point is, because I'm sure you've been seeing all the news about, ye and all these anti-Semitic statements being made now. And so the relationship has seemed to be definitely growing wider from Blacks and Jews coming together. So where I'm going with this is this point, and I made this point last night. I said that from my perspective, that if we entered the conversation in the group dynamic, meaning that I'm Black and you're Jewish, then we're going to always be forced to deal with all the biases and baggage that goes along with that, as opposed to entering the conversation as human beings. I see you as a human being who happens to be Black or who happens to be Jewish. And then when you begin to connect on that deeper level first, that's a much deeper relationship. And I think that the reason I wanted to bring that context up is that's what I see happening with all the murders. You can't murder someone that you see as a human being. You murder someone that you see as an object. And you can, in your mind, say, this object is in my way, or this object is causing me inconvenience, or whatever it is, they need to be getting rid of. And that's what the movies show you. Just get rid of that problem. That problem just has to be a human being. So now bring that back to the planet. The same logic applies. See, I think that as our podcast talks about being fully human and making fully human connections, that's a journey within itself to become more fully human. And as you embark on that journey, it doesn't just change the fact of how you see other living creatures. You also see, as you say, the world, the planet we live on, as a living entity. And we understand that. If you're a gardener, you clearly see that the world is a living thing. When you plant some in the ground and it grows from a seed and you nurture that, you see that that's the earth is living. The trees are an indication of that. So when you begin to partake and say, I want to become more fully human, that to me is understanding that you are of an ecosystem and you're part of it, and you must act in accordance for the best survival of that. And it takes you away from this negative ego, tribal, capitalistic society mindset that most people have. And that's based on our media and these systems that we live in creating that.
Yeah. And I love that you pointed to the idea of, seeing something or someone other as object. It's not as a human. And then tying that back to the planet, because our our earliest industrial ancestors, post the Industrial Revolution, didn't understand, and this is not to pardon everything that they did, but we're privy to much more information about the impact of air pollution, water pollution, ground pollution on the planet than they were. They didn't know everything that they were doing. They weren't, I don't think they were completely ignorant of it, but they had industrial waste. They always build factories near some kind of a river or body of water. And what's the easiest way to get rid of it? Right? Just let it flow into the river or the lake or the water, whatever it happens to be. Same thing with, look at the sky, an infinite sky. Snow, build a smokestack and just put it all up there. But nowadays, and for the last at least half century or more, definitely more, we know the impact of what we put into the sky, what we put into the land, what we put into the water. And we've made some progress. I mean, there is legislation there, the Hudson River, near where I grew up, and I'm probably an hour from the Hudson right now, is much cleaner in 2022 than it was in 1972 because of efforts made to, to take care of that body of water, which empties out into, New York Harbor, but begins in this little kind of spring, this little trickle up, I think, north of Albany, near Lake George somewhere. I forget exactly where in New York State. But that river was horribly polluted. PCPs, there was a General Motors plant there in Tarrytown that just put its waste in there for years. That plant is gone now. But so there were other stories like that across the country. So there is good news. There is progress because people have campaigned to take care of the. But we're still, as we said at the top of the conversation, most of the people who I trust in these conversations are saying we can begin to minimize some of the damage, make it less than it's going to be, but there's going to be problems because we've waited too long. In terms of the ocean levels rising, the glaciers melting, and they're going to the water rising is going to primarily hurt people in, if we say there are developed nations, then there are developing nations, and then there are undeveloped nations. The poorest people on the planet tend to live with the least automation. They live closest to the planet, meaning that they eat what they can, and they still kill game, and they still, practice horticulture and eat what they can plant, and they live close to rivers and oceans and bays. And as the water levels rise, they're going to be pushed further and further inland, if not killed by the rising water levels. So again, the consequences of the behaviors of the developed nations, again, not just the United States, includes all of Europe, Asia, any place where there are, South America, places where there are developed in post-industrial nations, they've created an issue which affects the poorest people on the planet and the poorest people in those nations, who tend to be less protected from the elements than those of us who are maybe, I don't think you and I aren't sitting on big piles of money that we can just escape into space with, but we're relatively safe from that, compared to a lot of people around the planet. So, and then the developed nations then want to turn to the developing nations and say, well, you really can't use coal anymore because of its pollution, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And it's all the things that the United States, that China, that virtually every European country has done for the better part of a century that has led to all of the planetary problems. Was, okay, we did it, but you can't do it because we know the problems now. So there's this real kind of, not really a paradox, there's a real kind of irony to it. We've created this problem and try to resolve it, or at least make believe we're trying to resolve it. We're saying to other less developed countries, well, you can't do what we did. It's kind of like growing up. when our parents would say, "Do as I say, not as I do."
Right.
There's some of that going on um, in terms of nations interacting around climate change. It's a real complex problem. I mean, you and I are addressing it in the context of healing America's narratives and the shadow of the United States, but the complexities um, of the problem of you know the stewardship of the planet are are really significant. And I wouldn't pretend it's not my area of expertise. It's one of the things I speak about in the book because it's emblematic. But I wouldn't, pretend to by any means be an expert on it. Um, but if we don't address it, all of our concerns, our rightful concerns around race, gender, orientation, income inequality, all of that, all of which are very, very important. If there's no humans left, it's not going to matter. Um,
Absolutely.
so,
Or even, the situation before that, the like you said, in your gratitude moment, you talk about running water, plumbing. And you talked about it earlier as well as us taking for granted that we have the ability to have unlimited water. I know folks who give their dogs filtered water, that's their pets, and so with that being said, imagine that step before humans perish that we have to go through all the atrocities, and now the United States doesn't have clean drinking water. That's a rarity now. That's something that's, like you said, it always, we've indicated it's already happened in 2 cities within the United States.
yeah.
So it's definitely going that direction. And again, if you look at, in both cases, it was because of corporate greed. That's the cause of it, right? It's not nature; it's a corporate greed that's the cause of it. And that always brings it back to the question I've always asked. The same thing when it comes to the mass shootings and the killings. It's like, how many have to die before we say, okay, the hell with arguing about what's right and what I have the right to do is I stop the killing because we don't want to see anybody else die like this. Like, so same thing I bring down to the climate issue. At what point do we get to the point where we're saying enough is enough? That everybody's going to take some form of action to modify their behaviors so that we can not bring forth the situation. Because, I need to even add it to my list of gratitudes now to have clean drinking water. Like, I actually purchased my water from a gentleman who has a bottling company. He brings uh, water that's infused with actually, I can't believe I'm getting the term now. It shows you the age I'm getting, but alkaline infused water, and it's delicious. I mean, I love it. I get it by about the 5 gallons, and he put on a website on his website that early November that he was shut down for the rest of the year, and I panicked. Like, where am I gonna get my water from? Right? Yeah, I really love his water. That's how accustomed I've gotten to use drinking his water. And as we talk about this in the climate global perspective, I couldn't imagine, and that was just that one little inconvenience. Of course, I can go to John and get some, somewhere else. But where I'm going with this is how much I love water to be able to drink, not the added bonus of being able to take a bath, to brush my teeth, to use a toilet that we just take for granted every single time that water is always going to be there and that's always going to work. Yep. So that's where I want to, as we now getting near the top of the hour, is what do you see as some of the solutions or takeaways that folks can begin to take from this conversation to begin to put behaviors with these suggestions you're making?
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to lead into answering that question by touching on something you said, because you went back to the gun violence piece. And what we're speaking about in terms of climate change and the planet is really the environment in the biggest sense of that, our environmental health. And environment has that, also reflects or refers to our cultural or societal environment. And the cultural societal environment of the United States is the most violent one in the post-industrial democratic countries on the planet. Nobody's even close. The number of times we kill each other every day with guns and with other things, but we're just focusing on guns. So it's so there's the climate problem with the environment, environmental issues with the planet, but then there's also this cultural and societal problem with the environment. We live in an unsafe environment because when I was in school and even in college and the first few years I was out working as a teacher, I never thought about somebody walking into a restaurant or a school or whatever kind of a place up and just killing people. Never crossed my mind because it wasn't happening back in, this is in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. That's different now. So the environment in the whole country is different. To your question, and this can be co-opted, what I'm about to say, but I'm going to trust that, it probably will be by some folks, but most won't. The primary thing that we can do is be an exemplar, embody, behave in the world in the way you want the world to be. Behave in the world in a way you want the world to be for your children and your grandchildren. And as you said, using the Native American metaphor of 7 generations, show up every day in your interactions with other human beings, in your interaction with the natural world, with your interactions with how you use resources. Show up in a way that somewhat biases the healthy feminine, so you recognize that you're in relationship with the resources you're fortunate enough to have, you're in relationship with all other human beings, and behave in that way such that your behavior, even if it's a tiny speck today, makes the environment, whether it's the natural environment or the societal and cultural environment in which you navigate, your workplace or your home, your neighborhood, it's a little bit better for everybody. And if that's too much work, behave in a way that you don't make it any worse. Keep it where it is. But it comes down to, how do I see the world? What am I in relationship with, and how am I in it? And what is my impact on these people, these resources, this neighborhood, this workplace, and then, this planet, but you get the idea. But, it goes back to Gandhi. Be the change you want to see in the world. It's, change everything overnight. Show up that way. Be the goodness that you have. The full humanness that you have, and the connections that you have with people. And as you said, don't see a Jew, don't see a black person, don't see a white person, don't see a gay person, don't see a straight person. See a human being who happens to have one or more of those characteristics, but at a species level, just like you, just like me. So that's my attempt at an all-encompassing answer.
Well, no, that's great advice. That's words of wisdom, and I completely concur with that 100%. I just want to add to that is that I think that one of the ways we could definitely will have a significant impact on climate change that I think we all can do is get rid of Yankees. They don't win anymore at any level. And I think people going to the games and wearing their paraphernalia and the jerseys, the logos, and watching them on TV just creates more energy resource the planet can't handle anymore. So I think the Yankees have won enough games so we can just do away with Yankees organization. And I think you'll see a significant improvement in the environment for that waste. No, that's a joke. I'm just kidding on that.
No, I know. I can tell. But that's a whole other thing we can get into in another conversation. That's not with the Yankees, but with certain industries, primarily entertainment, because professional sports is an entertainment industry. And
Right.
That's no way to disparage the athletes who are phenomenal at what they do. but the level at which they're compensated and is excessive. Not all of them, but some of the contract negotiations are excessive, and it's paradoxical because it took Kurt Flood, right? Yeah, I mean, decades ago, to basically look at baseball players' salaries and say, all right, somebody's making a lot of money here, and it's not the players. So he was responsible for filing a suit and arguing for free agency, which was an important move. Right. So, but now it's gone in the other direction where, $40 million in a season, or 30 million, or whatever it is. So, because it's hard getting by on $5 million in a year, right? So, come on. I mean, but that's that, and that. I don't mean to pick on professional sports because I love sports, but the excess across the corporate world, that you have to compensate. People should be paid well for being good at what they do. No argument from me, especially if they're the best at what they do. But there's a point at which once you're exponentially beyond subsistence, and there's no chance unless you're the cryptocurrency guy, whose name I forget, who managed to disappear $32 billion overnight. If you're that inept or dishonest, give me $5 million, give me $1 million in 1 year. Like, I'm going to be pretty good because I know how to live on significantly less than that.
Well, see, that is the most operative word you use in that sentence, is that you learn how to live off less than that. Yeah. I think most people who constantly live above their means, and if you give them $1 million a year, that'll seem like a lot initially. And then within a year or two later, they'll be right back where they are, living beyond their means. They'll need $2 million a year to sustain their lifestyle now, because they haven't learned how to live within a modest lifestyle.
Yeah.
But one last thing I wanted to just add a point, then we do our closeouts on who we find to be, or who we believe to be fully human connections examples. The thing about the players, I agree that the players' salaries are excessive, but I also think that the owners can't make as much money either. I think it has to be a shift all the way around, and that way we can reduce some of the ticket prices and everything else. Because the owners shouldn't be able to make billions of dollars, while the players who we come to see can't share in that lion's share. But I do think if everybody took a step back, and make it with the intent of making it more affordable, like, it's insane to try to go to a basketball or baseball game when it's a World Series and the tickets are $500 or $1,000 or $1,500, even more. That to me is excessive. So you make it only for the rich at that point, and it's not even accessible for other people unless you're watching the regular TV. But that's another conversation for another day.
Yeah. But I agree with you 100%. Across the board in those industries, it has to shift, not just with the players. I definitely agree with that. I can't afford to pay $10 for a hot dog. Are you kidding me? I can buy 2 pounds of hot dogs for $10. Come on.
Exactly. So, yeah. So as we do our normal closeout, do you have a person in mind? I'll let you go first if you want to go first.
Yeah, Steve. I'm just going to jump in, and I'm going to I don't know if I forget if I've said this before, but I'm just going to honor my dad, who was, he was born in 1907, died in 1996. World War II veterans in the Pacific and in World War II in the Navy, and a funny guy, little guy, but 5'2", weighed about 125 pounds, but he worked his entire work life as a plumber. And he retired when he was 71. Now I'm 68 now. And he just quietly went to work every day. I know what a 68-year-old body works. It feels like. And I've never had to work. I mean, I've done jobs with my hands and my body, but my educator and a coach and a writer. And I just wanted to just deep bow to him, because I can't imagine what his 71-year-old body felt like. His 67, 68, 69, he went to work in his late 60s, early 70s, And he wasn't like hanging out doing nothing. Like he had a pipe wrench in his hand. He was going into ditches. He was carrying things. It just amazes me. And it was of that generation where they didn't have the word depressed. So he would never come home and say, I think I'm depressed, or I'm just overwhelmed with work. They just do it. So I just want to honor, not that there's good things that you don't take, time and rest and recover either. I mean, men have to learn how to do that. But I just have a deep bow of respect for that level of commitment and dedication to take care of his family and do what he did. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and keeping in line with our parents, I have to say, my mom, I would be my choice for today as well. Um, she's a person who I would say definitely has always been a servant leader. I'm growing up in as a child, she was like the woman who was willing to let all the other kids come into the house and always feed them.
Mm-hmm.
I can still talk to my friends to this day, talk about the impact my mom had on their lives, how she fed them, how she was always a giver, a server, active heavily in her church, giving and serving. And then she moved to the DC area and lived in the DC area in an apartment that she's been in since she's been here since 87. And even when the population changed from being about maybe 60-40 black to white to now being like 90% Ethiopian or African immigrant that lives in her building. And I remember her still watching their kids. And, she would watch their kids, not for the money, because they would pay her $5 a week, some insane $20 a week, some insane fee. But she would do it because she would always say, well, they can't afford it anymore. My brother used to argue with her like, Mom just saw them bring a big screen TV in. How you gonna watch their kids for $20 a week and let them, because childcare is expensive, But my mom just continued to want to be that woman who wanted to be that servant leader and help, so she was instrumental in another generation of children growing up and experiencing a woman who has that kind of loving, compassion, I should say, spirit. And that's what Tyler Perry tapped into, is the black woman trope. And built his career off that, because that's a very powerful figure within the black race. And I would say that's probably why, if you look at what's going on now, the new generations are suffering from that. Because anybody who's my age, or I would probably say you can go down to the first generation of millennials, maybe the ones who are 40, 42. Anybody older than that can always talk about the importance of having a big mom in their lives. This grandmother, this aunt who just was always a matriarch of the whole entire family. So I definitely want to commend my mom, because she was definitely fully human, living that life. And if I could live up to be her level of service, leadership, and compassion and caring for others, then I know I would have made a difference.
Amen. Yeah. I love that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing about your father as well. So that's why we keep doing this podcast, because, as we discuss your book as an example, but the goal is always to look at what we can do to become more fully human by understanding the history of the past atrocities and, as you say, healing American narratives along the way. But our goal is, in everybody's own individual lives, is focus on what you can do to become more fully human in all your actions. And hopefully you'll see the world and the places in the ecosystem and begin to see human beings surround you and a living entity that you're existing and living on. And that can hopefully change your behaviors. So with that being said, Reg, thank you again for joining me today, investing the time and energy on today's show.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's always my pleasure to be here. I enjoy this. Yeah.
And listening audience, we want to thank you again for listening to another episode. I know we've missed a couple of weeks here, but thank you for tuning in today, and looking forward to building back with you all, next Wednesday. Until then, everybody continue to look for ways to become more fully human. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.